Tonight, we travel back in time to a world that once existed and now only whispers. Imagine standing at the edge of the Sahara, where the land stretches endlessly and offers no shelter from heat, wind, or silence. The air is dry, filled with dust that settles on skin and lungs, reminding you with every breath that survival here is never guaranteed. There is no water in sight, no trees to break the horizon, only sand shaped by forces that do not acknowledge human presence. This is a landscape that does not adapt to those who enter it. It demands discipline, patience, and constant awareness from anyone who attempts to cross it. Mistakes are not corrected here, and weakness is rarely forgiven. And yet, within this vast and unforgiving space, a city took form. Not a city of stone towers or military walls, but a settlement built from earth, trade, belief, and memory. A place whose influence did not come from armies, but from the careful preservation of knowledge. Timbuktu emerged where movement and stillness met. Caravans crossed the desert like fragile lifelines, carrying salt, gold, stories, and ideas across distances that tested both body and mind. The city existed because these journeys continued, despite the cost they demanded. Reaching Timbuktu required endurance before reward. Travelers faced days of relentless heat, nights of sudden cold, and long stretches where progress felt uncertain. Those who arrived did so altered by the journey, carrying fatigue, discipline, and caution with them. Life within the city offered no illusion of comfort. Water remained scarce, heat shaped daily rhythm, and survival depended on structure rather than abundance. Even knowledge, the city's greatest treasure, existed under constant threat of loss. Within modest buildings and shaded courtyards, scholars gathered to study law, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and faith. Their work was not abstract, but practical, shaped by the need to understand a world that rarely explained itself. Every copied page represented resistance against forgetting. Manuscripts were stored carefully, protected from heat, moisture, and time. They were handled not as relics, but as tools for continuity. In a place where so much could vanish, preservation became an act of survival. Timbuktu existed under constant pressure. Trade routes shifted, political powers changed, and environmental hardship returned without warning. The city endured not through dominance, but through adaptation. Its reputation grew far beyond its walls. Stories transformed it into legend, exaggerating wealth while overlooking fragility. The reality was quieter, harsher, and more disciplined. This is not a story of myth or fantasy. It is the story of people who lived within limits, negotiated hierarchy, and pursued knowledge in a place that offered no protection. A story shaped by sand, silence, faith, and restraint. As you listen, this is an invitation to imagine not greatness, but endurance. To consider what it meant to wake each day in a world where survival was never assumed. To enter a city that balanced learning against loss. Tonight, we approach Timbuktu as it was lived. Not as legend, but as reality. A city that existed because people accepted its demands. The Sahara is not an empty landscape, but a force that defines every form of movement, settlement, and survival within its reach, stretching beyond sight and persisting beyond memory. It does not invite passage, nor does it resist it actively, but instead imposes conditions so absolute that human presence remains temporary by default. Anyone who enters this environment does so under rules that cannot be negotiated, altered, or ignored without consequence. Long before Timbuktu existed as a city, the desert already shaped the logic that would make such a settlement possible. Its heat compressed time into narrow windows of action, while its vastness demanded patience rather than speed. Here, survival depended not on strength, but on restraint, preparation, and an acceptance of limitation. The Sahara erased errors quickly. Misjudged distances, poorly calculated water supplies, or impatience with terrain resulted not in correction, but in disappearance. The desert offered no margin for recovery once thresholds were crossed. Movement across this space was therefore deliberate. Caravans advanced slowly not out of fear, but because experience had proven that haste multiplied risk. Every step reflected calculation shaped by generations who had learned which choices could not be reversed. The desert communicated constantly, though never directly. Wind direction, sand texture, star visibility, and animal behavior formed a language that could not be written, only internalized. Those who failed to learn this language rarely survived long enough to try again. Listening became a skill. Not listening in the sense of sound, but in attention to absence, to subtle shifts, and to patterns that emerged only through repetition. Knowledge here was cumulative, fragile, and dependent on memory rather than record. In this environment, reputation traveled faster than people. Stories passed along caravan routes, carried by merchants and guides who spoke carefully of what lay ahead. Among these stories were whispers of a place where movement slowed and knowledge accumulated. These accounts were never consistent. Some described wealth, others spoke of danger, and many emphasized endurance rather than reward. What united them was the understanding that reaching such a place required more than intention. The desert functioned as a filter. It removed those who were unprepared, impatient, or careless long before they approached any settlement. Only those who adapted to its demands were allowed to continue. Days within the Sahara unfolded as extended tests of attention. Water had to be rationed precisely, pace adjusted to heat, and energy conserved without sacrificing progress. Every decision carried weight because correction was rarely possible. Night offered no true relief. Temperatures dropped sharply, fatigue deepened, and the sky expanded into a reminder of isolation rather than comfort. Sleep became a measured act rather than a refuge. Rest itself required discipline. Too little weakened the body, while too much delayed movement and increased exposure. Balance was learned through experience rather than instruction. The desert altered perception of distance. Horizons remained fixed regardless of effort, eroding confidence in progress and demanding trust in calculation. Success was defined not by arrival, but by continuation. Those who crossed this space learned to redefine achievement. Survival became its own measure, separate from destination. To endure another day was sufficient proof of competence. By the time travelers neared the region where Timbuktu would later emerge, they carried more than goods. They carried habits shaped by scarcity, caution shaped by exposure, and an understanding that permanence was rare. The desert had already altered them. No dramatic boundary announced the approach to settlement. There were no walls rising suddenly from the sand, no immediate relief from heat or isolation. Instead, signs accumulated gradually. Paths converged. Caravan traffic increased, and repetition replaced rumor as the source of information. Knowledge of place emerged through pattern rather than declaration. Timbuktu formed not in opposition to the desert, but as a response to it. Its location reflected compromise between accessibility and protection, exposure and restraint. The city existed because it aligned itself with environmental reality rather than attempting to overcome it. Even within its reach, the desert remained present. Sand entered streets, heat dictated daily rhythm, and water scarcity shaped every aspect of planning. The environment was never forgotten. Structures were built from earth rather than stone. Their materials reflected impermanence, adaptation, and acceptance of erosion. Nothing about the city suggested defiance. To live here required continuous awareness. Every action remained tied to resource management, seasonal variation, and the reliability of trade routes. Forgetting the desert was not an option. This pressure shaped the mindset of those who settled. Ambition was moderated by calculation, and expansion was secondary to stability. Endurance mattered more than display. The desert remained at the edge of every decision. It influenced how far one could travel, how much could be stored, and how long knowledge could be preserved. Its presence limited excess and punished neglect. Timbuktu would later become known for scholarship, manuscripts, and learning. Yet none of that could have existed without prior adaptation to the desert's demands. Knowledge itself depended on survival first. Before scholars gathered, before texts were copied, before reputation extended beyond the Sahara, there was only environment. And that environment shaped every structure that followed. The desert whispered constantly, reminding inhabitants that their existence remained conditional. It never announced its authority. It simply persisted. And persistence was enough. Timbuktu did not appear suddenly, nor did it rise in opposition to the desert that surrounded it, but emerged slowly as a settlement shaped by restraint, repetition, and an acceptance of fragility as a permanent condition. Its existence was never guaranteed, and from the beginning the city reflected an understanding that survival in this region required alignment with the environment rather than domination over it. What later generations would describe as golden walls were, in reality, structures born from earth, patience, and continuous maintenance, standing not as symbols of triumph, but as evidence of adaptation. The earliest buildings were constructed from sun-dried mud brick, timber, and packed earth, materials chosen not for grandeur but for availability and thermal balance. These walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, moderating temperature in a way stone could not. Architecture in Timbuktu was therefore practical before it was symbolic, and durability was measured in seasons rather than centuries. Nothing in the city was meant to last untouched. Walls cracked, roofs eroded, and surfaces dissolved under rain and sun, requiring constant repair and collective effort. Maintenance was not a failure of construction, but an expected rhythm of life that reinforced awareness of impermanence. From a distance, Timbuktu did not dominate the horizon. Its profile blended into the surrounding land, low and restrained, avoiding the vertical assertions of power seen in imperial capitals elsewhere. Approach to the city was gradual, marked more by changes in human activity than by architecture. Caravan routes converged before the settlement became visible. Tracks multiplied, footprints overlapped, and movement slowed as travelers prepared to transition from endurance to negotiation. The city announced itself through human density rather than monumental display. Entry into Timbuktu did not offer relief from hardship. Heat remained present, water scarcity persisted, and the demands of discipline did not ease at the boundary of the city. What changed was the structure through which hardship was managed. Streets were narrow and winding, intentionally limiting direct exposure to the sun while creating pockets of shade that shifted throughout the day. Buildings clustered closely, producing shared walls and collective responsibility for maintenance and stability. Urban form reflected cooperation rather than individuality. Walls in Timbuktu served to guide movement and define space, not to repel armies or guarantee protection. They offered minimal defense against intrusion, but they organized daily life and reinforced social boundaries. Security emerged from shared norms, hierarchy, and expectation rather than fortification. The city's color shifted constantly. At dawn and dusk, mud walls reflected light in warm tones that later observers interpreted as signs of wealth and splendor. Under the full sun, however, these same surfaces appeared muted and fragile, revealing the temporary nature of their brilliance. Daily rhythm was dictated by climate. Work, trade, and travel concentrated in early morning and late afternoon, while midday hours were reserved for rest, study, and retreat. The city functioned by yielding to environmental limits rather than challenging them. Water shaped every decision. Wells required careful management, and access to them reinforced obligation, authority, and social order. Scarcity demanded planning, and waste carried consequences that extended beyond individuals. Timbuktu's prosperity depended on its position within broader networks rather than local abundance. Gold, salt, textiles, manuscripts, and food arrived through long-distance exchange, linking the city to regions far beyond the Sahara. Survival depended on continuity of movement rather than isolation. Markets formed the visible center of urban life. Here, exchange occurred within systems governed by reputation, religious obligation, and long-standing relationships. Trade was embedded in social structure, not separated from it. Wealth in Timbuktu was uneven and unstable. Sudden disruption of routes, political conflict, or environmental hardship could erode prosperity quickly. Accumulation, therefore, carried risk alongside advantage. The city's reputation as a place of abundance concealed its vulnerability. Visitors often mistook concentration of goods for permanence, overlooking the effort required to sustain balance. Timbuktu functioned as a conduit rather than a reservoir. Authority within the city was distributed and negotiated. Scholars, merchants, religious leaders, local elites, and external rulers each exerted influence under changing conditions. Power remained fluid, shaped by circumstance rather than fixed hierarchy. Mosques served as more than places of worship. They functioned as centers of education, arbitration, and social regulation, integrating faith into daily governance. Religious authority reinforced order where material power remained limited. The Sankoré complex symbolized the city's deeper priorities. Its modest scale contrasted with its intellectual significance, emphasizing continuity through learning rather than dominance through force. Knowledge became a form of infrastructure. Despite its reputation, Timbuktu remained exposed. Its location invited opportunity, but also pressure from surrounding powers and nomadic groups. Stability depended on diplomacy, negotiation, and adaptation. Residents lived with awareness of contingency. Prosperity was understood as temporary, requiring constant reinforcement through maintenance and restraint. Complacency carried immediate consequences. Foreign observers frequently misunderstood the city. They searched for spectacle and found routine, expected fortresses and encountered discipline. Strength here lay in systems rather than appearance. Stories transformed Timbuktu into legend. Gold was exaggerated, secrecy invented, and distance romanticized. These narratives obscured the reality of daily management and vulnerability. Inside the city, life proceeded under measured expectations. Roles were defined, obligations recognized, and survival coordinated through shared norms. Order emerged from acceptance rather than coercion. Maintenance remained constant. Walls required repair after rains, roofs demanded reinforcement, and streets needed clearing. Decay was managed rather than denied. Time unfolded cyclically. Seasons dictated movement, study followed established rhythms, and preparation repeated annually. Progress was incremental and fragile. Expansion was limited. Growth remained constrained by water availability, trade capacity, and social cohesion. Stability outweighed ambition. The city endured through restraint. It survived by resisting excess, managing expectation, and preserving continuity. Its walls symbolized discipline rather than power. What later generations remembered as grandeur was balance. A city sustained through adaptation rather than domination. A settlement that understood its dependence on environment. The golden image that inspired myth was fleeting. Under sun, dust, and time, the city remained materially modest. Its true strength lay beyond appearance. Before scholarship defined its legacy, Timbuktu learned to endure. It became a city by accepting fragility rather than denying it. That acceptance shaped everything that followed. Sankoré was never intended to be a monument in the way empires understood monuments, nor was it designed to overwhelm the observer through scale, ornament, or architectural dominance, but emerged instead as a functional center shaped by the needs of study, instruction, and continuity within a fragile environment. Its importance did not come from height or visibility, but from the concentration of disciplined thought that took place within its walls, often quietly, away from spectacle. What developed there was not an academy separated from life, but an intellectual structure embedded directly into the daily survival of the city. The scholars who gathered at Sankoré did not form a single class with uniform authority. They represented a wide spectrum of legal traditions, regional backgrounds, and intellectual lineages, connected less by hierarchy than by shared commitment to preservation and transmission. Learning here functioned as a network rather than an institution, relying on personal reputation, apprenticeship, and demonstrated competence. Knowledge in Timbuktu was never abstract. It was pursued because it offered tools for understanding a world shaped by uncertainty, scarcity, and constant negotiation. Law provided structure, theology offered meaning, astronomy assisted navigation and timekeeping, and mathematics supported trade and inheritance. The act of study was therefore inseparable from practical life. Texts were not collected for admiration, but for use, reference, and debate. A manuscript mattered because it could be applied, interpreted, or taught, not because it was rare. Instruction at Sankoré followed no fixed curriculum imposed from above. Students sought teachers whose expertise aligned with their interests or needs, often traveling long distances to study with a specific scholar. Authority emerged through recognition rather than appointment. Teaching occurred in courtyards, shaded rooms, and mosque spaces adapted for discussion. Lessons unfolded through reading, commentary, memorization, and argument, requiring patience and sustained attention. Learning progressed slowly, shaped by repetition rather than acceleration. The pace of intellectual life reflected the environment. Heat limited endurance, daylight dictated schedule, and silence was necessary for concentration. Study adapted to these constraints rather than resisting them. Manuscripts circulated continuously among scholars. Texts were borrowed, copied, annotated, and returned, creating layers of interpretation that accumulated across generations. No single version of a text was considered final. Copying was an act of discipline. Errors carried consequences, and attention to detail was essential. The physical process of transcription reinforced respect for content. Ownership of manuscripts did not always imply exclusivity. Texts often remained within families or scholarly circles, shared under conditions of trust and obligation. Knowledge was protected through relationship rather than isolation. Sankoré scholars operated within an ethical framework that emphasized responsibility. knowledge carried weight, and misuse was considered a moral failure. Learning imposed obligation as much as privilege. Legal scholarship played a central role. Interpretation of Islamic law guided contracts, inheritance, dispute resolution, and social conduct. Judgment required familiarity with precedent as well as sensitivity to local conditions. This balance between text and context defined Sankoré's intellectual character. Abstract principles were constantly tested against lived reality. Rigid interpretation was discouraged in favor of reasoned application. Astronomy and mathematics supported both scholarship and survival. Calculation-assisted navigation across the desert, determined prayer times, and regulated calendars essential for trade and ritual. These disciplines linked intellectual inquiry directly to movement and coordination. Theological study addressed uncertainty rather than eliminating it. Faith provided structure for endurance, not guarantees of comfort or protection. Questions were explored within accepted boundaries, but questioning itself was not forbidden. Debate was expected. Disagreement did not threaten authority when conducted within recognized frameworks. Scholarly reputation depended on clarity of reasoning rather than dominance. Students advanced through demonstration rather than certification. Mastery was shown through teaching, commentary, and the ability to resolve complex questions. Learning was continuous and rarely considered complete. Foreign scholars and travelers contributed to this environment. Ideas arrived from North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond, carried along the same routes as goods. Sankoré functioned as a point of convergence rather than isolation. Language reflected this exchange. Arabic served as a scholarly medium, while local languages shaped interpretation and application. Multilingual competence enhanced authority. Scholars were not removed from economic reality. Many engaged in trade, advised merchants, or managed family holdings. Intellectual life was supported by material stability, not separated from it. Despite its influence, Sankoré remained vulnerable. Political shifts, economic disruption, or violence could threaten scholars and their work. Preservation required constant vigilance. Manuscripts were hidden, relocated, or dispersed during periods of instability. Families assumed responsibility for protecting texts when institutions could not. Knowledge survived through decentralization. The authority of Sankoré did not rely on enforcement. It depended on recognition across distance and time. Its influence extended as far as its ideas were carried. Students who departed took more than texts. They carried methods of reasoning, ethical frameworks, and expectations of discipline. Sankoré extended itself through people rather than territory. The scholarly culture of Timbuktu resisted spectacle. Learning occurred quietly, persistently, and often invisibly. Its impact accumulated rather than announced itself. This restraint allowed scholarship to coexist with instability. When conditions worsened, intellectual life adapted rather than collapsed. Flexibility ensured continuity. Sankoré's legacy was therefore not defined by architecture or centralized authority. It was defined by transmission, by the ability of knowledge to survive movement, disruption, and time. The scholars understood fragility. They wrote knowing texts could be lost, destroyed, or forgotten. Preservation was an act of resistance. In a city shaped by sand and scarcity, learning required humility. Knowledge did not promise control. It offered orientation. Sankoré functioned as a stabilizing force not because it eliminated uncertainty, but because it provided tools to navigate it. Its scholars did not claim certainty where none existed. They prepared minds to endure complexity. The intellectual life of Timbuktu cannot be separated from its environment. Heat, distance, and vulnerability shaped how knowledge was pursued and valued. Understanding required patience. What emerged at Sankoré was not an empire of the mind. It was a culture of endurance. One that treated learning as a responsibility rather than a display. Manuscripts in Timbuktu were never passive objects resting quietly on shelves, nor were they treated as symbols meant to impress visitors with displays of accumulated knowledge, but existed instead as working instruments whose value depended entirely on use, transmission, and survival under difficult conditions. Each manuscript represented an effort to resist disappearance in a world where heat, dust, insects, moisture, political instability, and time itself conspired continuously against preservation. Writing in this environment was therefore an act undertaken with awareness that permanence was unlikely, and that continuity could only be achieved through repetition rather than endurance. The physical form of these manuscripts reflected this reality. Pages were made from materials chosen for availability and practicality, bound carefully but rarely luxuriously, and stored in ways that prioritized concealment and protection over visibility. Books were meant to survive movement, not remain fixed in place. Manuscripts covered an extraordinary range of subjects. Law, theology, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, grammar, history, ethics, and poetry all found expression in written form, often copied and recopied as texts moved between scholars, families, and regions. No single category dominated, because knowledge itself was not compartmentalized. A legal text might sit beside a medical treatise, while astronomical tables shared space with theological commentary. This proximity reflected how knowledge functioned in practice, with disciplines informing one another rather than existing in isolation. Understanding the world required integration rather than specialization. Copying manuscripts was laborious and slow. Scribes worked by hand, often under difficult conditions, relying on steady light, disciplined attention, and familiarity with both language and content. Errors carried consequences, not because of formal punishment, but because inaccuracy threatened transmission itself. Margins filled with commentary. Notes accumulated alongside original text, reflecting debate, clarification, disagreement, and adaptation across generations. A manuscript therefore recorded not only information, but intellectual conversation unfolding over time. Ownership of manuscripts rarely implied exclusivity. Texts moved between scholars through networks of trust, kinship, and obligation, circulating according to need rather than status. Access depended on relationship as much as learning. Families played a central role in preservation. Manuscripts were often inherited, hidden, divided, or relocated in response to threat, creating decentralized archives that reduced vulnerability. Knowledge survived because it was dispersed. Storage methods reflected constant awareness of environmental danger. Texts were kept in wooden chests, wrapped in cloth, elevated from ground moisture, and relocated when conditions changed. Preservation required vigilance rather than confidence. Heat remained the greatest adversary. Ink faded, pages warped, and bindings weakened under prolonged exposure, forcing continuous intervention. Maintenance never ended. Yet manuscripts continued to accumulate. Their survival depended less on ideal conditions than on collective commitment to reproduction. When one copy failed, another replaced it. This redundancy was intentional. No single manuscript was indispensable, because knowledge was understood as something that must exist in multiple forms to endure. Fragility was countered through multiplication. Texts did not remain static. They were adapted to local conditions, annotated with regional context, and interpreted through lived experience. Authority emerged through engagement rather than preservation alone. The presence of manuscripts reshaped daily life. Study required time carved out from labor, trade, and survival, reinforcing the idea that learning was a deliberate investment rather than a luxury. Education demanded sacrifice. Children in scholarly families encountered texts early. Memorization preceded interpretation, establishing familiarity before understanding. Learning unfolded slowly. Manuscripts supported legal continuity. Contracts, inheritance, and dispute resolution relied on written precedent interpreted through scholarship. Writing stabilized expectation in an unstable environment. Medical texts addressed practical necessity. Treatment methods, remedies, and observations circulated alongside spiritual considerations, reflecting a holistic approach to illness. Knowledge responded directly to need. Astronomical writings supported navigation and ritual. Calculation assisted orientation in the desert, regulated prayer times, and aligned daily life with celestial movement. The sky became another text to interpret. Poetry and ethics occupied their own space. They addressed endurance, humility, discipline, and responsibility, reinforcing values required for survival. Expression supported structure. Manuscripts also connected Timbuktu to distant worlds. Texts arrived from North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond, carried along the same routes as goods. Ideas traveled with caravans. Translation played a role. Arabic served as a scholarly medium, but local languages shaped interpretation and instruction. Meaning shifted through context. The accumulation of manuscripts created reputational gravity. Scholars traveled to Timbuktu because texts existed there, and texts accumulated because scholars traveled. Knowledge reinforced itself. Yet this concentration increased risk. Political instability, invasion, or economic disruption threatened not only people but memory. Preservation required foresight. During periods of danger, manuscripts were hidden. Families buried them, relocated them, or disguised their significance to avoid destruction or seizure. Survival depended on discretion. Loss occurred nonetheless. Texts disappeared, deteriorated, or were destroyed, leaving gaps that could not always be repaired. Preservation was never total. This awareness shaped scholarly attitude. Writers worked knowing that their efforts might vanish, yet continued regardless. Writing became an act of responsibility rather than expectation. The manuscripts of Timbuktu were not static monuments to a golden age. They were fragile threads connecting generations across uncertainty. Their survival depended on constant renewal. Knowledge existed here without guarantee. Its preservation relied on discipline, repetition, and collective care. Continuity was earned daily. In this way, manuscripts embodied the city itself. Both existed through adaptation rather than permanence. Both survived by accepting fragility. What later observers described as timeless wisdom was in fact sustained effort. Nothing endured by accident. Everything required attention. The manuscripts did not promise eternity. They resisted erasure. And that resistance defined their value. The Tuareg were never merely figures moving at the edges of Timbuktu's story, nor were they a single, unified presence that could be easily defined or reduced to stereotype, but represented a complex network of clans, traditions, and obligations shaped by the same desert that conditioned the city's existence. They lived not within walls, but within movement, navigating spaces that resisted settlement and required a form of knowledge fundamentally different from that practiced in urban centers. Their relationship to Timbuktu was therefore neither fully external nor fully internal, but existed in a state of continuous negotiation shaped by necessity, power, and survival. The Tuareg understood the Sahara as a lived environment rather than an obstacle. Where others perceived emptiness, they recognized routes, rhythms, and signs that transformed vast distances into navigable systems. This knowledge was not written, centralized, or easily transferred, but embedded in memory, experience, and lineage. Movement defined Tuareg life. Seasonal migration, caravan guidance, and control of key passages through the desert formed the foundation of their economic and political influence. Their power did not come from holding territory permanently, but from regulating access to it. Caravans depended on Tuareg guides to survive the journey across the Sahara. Knowledge of wells, safe passages, and timing could not be replaced by maps or rumor, because conditions shifted constantly and unpredictably. Without guidance, travelers risked disorientation, dehydration, and disappearance. This dependence created leverage. The Tuareg were not merely escorts, but arbiters of movement, capable of facilitating passage or withholding it. Their authority emerged from the desert itself, which rewarded familiarity and punished ignorance. The relationship between Timbuktu and the Tuareg was therefore practical rather than symbolic. Trade could not function without desert access, and desert access could not be secured without negotiation. Mutual reliance shaped interaction more than ideology. Tuareg society was organized through clan structures that distributed responsibility and authority according to lineage, gender, and role. Social order was maintained through custom rather than centralized enforcement, reinforcing cohesion across dispersed populations. Obligation carried weight because violation threatened survival. Identity among the Tuareg was marked visibly. Indigo-dyed veils, worn primarily by men, protected against sand and sun while signaling status and affiliation. These garments became symbols not of mystery, but of adaptation to environment. The desert demanded protection. Sandstorms, extreme temperatures, and exposure required constant awareness and preparedness. Clothing, equipment, and movement patterns evolved in response to these conditions. Tuareg involvement in trade extended beyond guidance. They acted as intermediaries, negotiators, and enforcers, ensuring that caravans reached destinations and obligations were honored. Trust depended on reputation built over time. Yet this position also introduced tension. Control of routes made the Tuareg powerful, but also exposed them to pressure from states and cities seeking to secure access independently. Conflict emerged when negotiation failed. Raiding occurred within this context. It was not random violence, but a regulated practice shaped by custom, retaliation, and economic calculation. Targets were chosen carefully, and actions followed understood boundaries. For Timbuktu, Tuareg raids represented both threat and reminder. They demonstrated the city's vulnerability and reinforced the need for diplomacy rather than direct confrontation. Military dominance was neither practical nor sustainable in this environment. The Tuareg were not external enemies in a simple sense. They interacted with Timbuktu through marriage, trade, alliance, and conflict, creating overlapping relationships that resisted clear division. Boundaries remained fluid. Some Tuareg groups settled temporarily near the city. Others maintained distance, appearing only when movement or negotiation required presence. Their visibility fluctuated with season and circumstance. The desert shaped Tuareg worldview. Uncertainty was accepted as a constant, and survival depended on flexibility rather than permanence. Attachment to fixed structures held less value than responsiveness to change. This contrasted with urban life. Cities like Timbuktu relied on accumulation, storage, and continuity, while nomadic systems emphasized mobility and adaptability. Both approaches represented responses to the same environment. Interaction between these systems produced tension, but also balance. Urban centers required movement to survive, while nomadic groups benefited from exchange and access to goods. Neither could dominate the other without consequence. Tuareg authority extended across generations. Knowledge of routes, alliances, and obligations was transmitted through practice rather than record. Experience carried more weight than formal declaration. Children learned early. Observation, participation, and repetition replaced instruction, embedding skill through exposure. Mistakes carried immediate consequences. The Tuareg approach to risk differed from urban calculation. Danger was managed through anticipation rather than avoidance, and uncertainty was integrated into planning. This mindset allowed endurance in conditions others found intolerable. Despite their influence, Tuareg power was constrained. Environmental dependence limited expansion, and internal divisions prevented centralization. Authority remained distributed. External empires sought to control desert routes. Attempts to impose centralized authority often failed because they underestimated the complexity of local knowledge. The desert resisted standardization. Timbuktu's scholars understood this reality. Legal and ethical frameworks accounted for negotiation rather than absolute rule, reflecting awareness of limits. Order emerged through compromise. Tuareg interaction with religion reflected similar pragmatism. Islam shaped practice and identity, but interpretation remained influenced by custom and environment. Belief adapted to movement. Spiritual authority did not eliminate uncertainty. It provided structure within it. Faith supported endurance rather than guaranteeing protection. Periods of increased instability intensified Tuareg influence. When trade routes shifted or political power weakened, reliance on desert knowledge grew. Control of movement became decisive. Conversely, when centralized authority strengthened, tension increased. Efforts to restrict nomadic autonomy threatened established balance. Conflict followed miscalculation. The Tuareg endured through adaptation. Their systems allowed survival across centuries of change, disruption, and pressure. Continuity depended on responsiveness. They were not relics of a disappearing world. They remained active participants in shaping regional dynamics. Movement ensured relevance. For Timbuktu, the Tuareg represented both limitation and lifeline. They constrained ambition while enabling connection. Their presence reinforced humility. The city could not exist without desert access. Desert access could not be secured without those who understood it. Interdependence was unavoidable. This relationship resisted simplification. It was neither alliance nor hostility, but ongoing negotiation shaped by circumstance. Stability depended on balance. As long as trade continued and movement remained possible, this balance held. When conditions shifted, strain followed. Adaptation determined survival. The Tuareg did not disappear into legend. They remained present, shaping routes, interactions, and outcomes. Their influence persisted beyond written record. Understanding Timbuktu requires acknowledging this presence. The city's story unfolded not only within walls, but across dunes and horizons. Movement defined existence. The desert never belonged to the city. It belonged to those who could move within it. And they continued to shape its fate. The prosperity of Timbuktu did not rest on what could be produced within its walls, nor on resources drawn from the surrounding land, but depended instead on an invisible network of exchange that stretched across regions, climates, and cultures, binding distant worlds together through movement rather than proximity. This network was not controlled from a single center, nor enforced through uniform authority, but sustained through trust, repetition, and shared recognition of mutual dependence. Gold and salt became its most visible symbols, yet the true substance of this system lay in the relationships and expectations that allowed exchange to continue across immense distances. Gold arrived from the south. Drawn from regions of forest and river beyond the desert's reach, it traveled northward through intermediaries who rarely saw its source and rarely knew its final destination. By the time it reached Timbuktu, gold had already passed through multiple hands, each exchange shaped by obligation, negotiation, and risk. Salt moved in the opposite direction. Extracted from desert mines where labor was harsh and conditions unforgiving, it traveled southward as an essential commodity rather than a luxury. In regions where heat and humidity threatened food preservation, salt carried value equal to survival. Neither gold nor salt held meaning in isolation. Their importance emerged through circulation, through the way each substance connected environments that could not sustain one another independently. Trade transformed scarcity in one region into stability in another. Timbuktu occupied a critical position within this exchange. It functioned as a point of convergence where goods, information, and people intersected before dispersing again along established routes. The city did not control this movement, but it facilitated and depended upon it. Caravans formed the arteries of this system. Moving slowly across the Sahara, they carried not only commodities, but expectations shaped by precedent and reputation. Each successful journey reinforced confidence in routes and relationships, while failure weakened trust. Trade required patience. Journeys took months, sometimes longer, and delays were common. Participants accepted uncertainty as part of exchange rather than an exception. Preparation determined outcome. Water, animals, provisions, and personnel had to be calculated precisely, because error could not easily be corrected once movement began. Economic success depended on logistical discipline. The network functioned without written contracts enforceable across distance. Instead, reputation served as currency, and violation of trust carried consequences that extended beyond individual transactions. A merchant known for dishonesty risked exclusion from future exchange. This system produced restraint. Short-term gain achieved through deception threatened long-term survival. Participants learned that continuity mattered more than profit. Timbuktu's merchants operated within this logic. They understood that accumulation without movement was meaningless, and that storage carried risk. Goods were valuable only insofar as they could be exchanged. Markets reflected this reality. Transactions occurred in open spaces where visibility reinforced accountability, and negotiation followed established conventions. Disputes were resolved through mediation rather than force. Weights and measures mattered. Consistency allowed trust to persist across encounters between strangers. Deviation invited suspicion. Religious and ethical frameworks supported exchange. Oaths, shared beliefs, and moral obligation reinforced expectation where enforcement was limited. Faith provided structure in the absence of centralized authority. The network extended beyond material goods. Ideas traveled alongside commodities, carried by scholars, pilgrims, and merchants who moved between regions. Knowledge followed the same routes as salt and gold. Manuscripts arrived in Timbuktu through trade. Texts copied in North Africa or the Middle East were exchanged, studied, and adapted within the city. Learning depended on movement. Language facilitated exchange. Arabic served as a medium of trade, scholarship, and religion, enabling communication across diverse populations. Local languages shaped interpretation and negotiation. Translation occurred continuously. Meaning shifted as ideas moved between contexts, requiring interpretation rather than replication. Knowledge adapted through exchange. Trade also carried risk. Caravans faced threats from weather, exhaustion, and conflict, and loss was accepted as possible rather than exceptional. Insurance took the form of diversification rather than guarantee. No single journey determined success. Sustainability emerged through repetition across time. Endurance mattered more than speed. Timbuktu's reliance on external routes created vulnerability. Disruption anywhere along the network could affect availability of goods and stability within the city. Prosperity depended on conditions beyond local control. Political shifts altered trade. Changes in power along routes influenced taxation, security, and access, forcing adaptation. Merchants adjusted paths rather than resisting authority directly. Environmental factors exerted similar influence. Drought, flooding, or changes in desert conditions reshaped movement patterns. Flexibility ensured survival. The network lacked permanence. Routes evolved, nodes rose and declined, and centers of exchange shifted over time. Timbuktu's prominence was contingent rather than guaranteed. Yet for centuries, the city remained relevant. Its position allowed it to absorb change without immediate collapse. Adaptation sustained continuity. The scale of exchange obscured individual labor. Behind each transaction stood countless acts of preparation, endurance, and negotiation. Trade compressed effort into outcome. Wealth appeared concentrated in the city. Observers saw goods assembled temporarily and mistook accumulation for abundance. In reality, resources flowed continuously rather than settling. This circulation shaped social hierarchy. Merchants gained influence through access and reliability, while others depended on their ability to mediate exchange. Economic roles carried social consequence. Yet merchants remained constrained. They operated within ethical, religious, and communal expectations that limited unchecked accumulation. Excess invited scrutiny. The network discouraged isolation. Withdrawal from exchange reduced resilience rather than increasing security. Connectivity ensured survival. Timbuktu's scholars recognized this interdependence. Legal and ethical frameworks addressed trade disputes, contracts, and obligation, reflecting awareness of economic reality. Knowledge reinforced exchange. Education supported commerce. Literacy, numeracy, and legal understanding enhanced reliability and reduced conflict. Learning functioned as infrastructure. The invisible network shaped identity. Participants understood themselves as part of a larger system extending beyond immediate surroundings. Belonging depended on participation rather than location. Distance altered perception. Goods acquired meaning through journey, and value increased with risk endured. Exchange transformed material significance. Trust accumulated slowly. Relationships strengthened through repeated success, while failure eroded confidence quickly. Reputation demanded protection. The network resisted centralization. Attempts to monopolize routes often failed, because flexibility allowed participants to bypass control. Decentralization ensured resilience. Timbuktu benefited from this structure. Its influence depended on participation rather than domination. Power flowed through access. As long as exchange continued, the city endured. When routes shifted or weakened, strain followed. Stability remained conditional. Gold and salt symbolized the network, but they did not define it. The true foundation lay in expectation, restraint, and adaptation. Trade functioned as a social contract. The invisible network sustained Timbuktu without guaranteeing permanence. It offered opportunity while demanding vigilance. Survival depended on awareness. Nothing in this system operated automatically. Every exchange required attention, memory, and judgment. Continuity emerged through effort. The city existed because movement continued. When movement faltered, so did stability. Exchange defined existence. The inner spaces of Timbuktu were never intended to be seen by those who passed through the city quickly, because their purpose was not to impress, announce status, or reinforce reputation, but to regulate life quietly in a place where exposure, heat, and exhaustion exerted constant pressure on every aspect of existence. Behind plain exterior walls and narrow entrances, beyond streets shaped for movement rather than comfort, lay enclosed courtyards designed to preserve balance in an environment that punished excess and rewarded restraint. These hidden gardens represented one of the city's most important survival strategies, not because they offered escape from hardship, but because they reduced its cumulative effects over time. The architecture of these spaces reflected generations of observation rather than abstract planning. Walls were positioned to trap cooler air while deflecting wind-driven sand. Openings were sized to admit light without inviting heat, and proportions were calibrated to slow airflow enough to create stillness without stagnation. Nothing was accidental, and nothing was decorative in a way that ignored function. In a city where the external environment demanded constant vigilance, these courtyards allowed controlled withdrawal without isolation. They did not remove inhabitants from the world beyond their walls, but moderated its intensity, creating conditions where the body could recover and the mind could remain attentive. Rest here was not indulgence, but preparation. Water defined the value of these spaces more than any other element. Wells and cisterns were protected carefully, their use governed by custom, hierarchy, and obligation, because access to water shaped not only comfort but survival itself. Mismanagement threatened households collectively, reinforcing discipline through shared dependence. Vegetation, when present, was selected for endurance rather than abundance. Palm trees, shrubs, and low plantings offered shade, moisture retention, and subtle cooling, altering microclimates within walls that otherwise absorbed heat relentlessly. Greenery here was not ornamental, but instrumental. These gardens served as centers of daily life rather than retreats from it. Families gathered in courtyards to organize labor, share meals, teach children, and negotiate obligations, using enclosure to reduce fatigue and preserve attention. Domestic rhythm adapted to climate through space rather than schedule. Children learn not through instruction alone, but through prolonged exposure to these patterns. They absorbed restraint, pacing, and awareness simply by sharing space with adults who moved deliberately, spoke softly, and conserved energy without complaint. Education began long before formal study. For scholars, the hidden gardens were essential. Sustained reading, memorization, and discussion required environments where heat, noise, and interruption were sufficiently reduced to allow concentration to persist across hours. These spaces functioned as extensions of the intellectual life of the city. Recitation unfolded slowly. Texts were spoken aloud, repeated, and committed to memory within courtyards that supported rhythm rather than speed, allowing learning to sink in gradually rather than overwhelm. Silence here was not absence, but structure. Sound behaved differently within enclosed walls. Voices softened, echoes diminished, and street noise receded, producing an acoustic environment that encouraged reflection and reduced tension. The city quieted itself deliberately. Privacy mattered deeply. Negotiations involving inheritance, trade, marriage, or dispute resolution often took place within these enclosed spaces, where reduced visibility lowered the risk of escalation. Architecture reinforced social stability by limiting exposure. The gardens also functioned as buffers between public and private life. They created layers of transition that allowed individuals to adjust gradually between the demands of trade, authority, and domestic responsibility. Abrupt shifts were softened through space. Religious practice adapted to these environments. Prayer, reflection, and instruction occurred in courtyards that balanced openness to the sky with protection from exposure, aligning spiritual rhythm with physical necessity. Faith here was practiced with awareness of limitation. These spaces were not distributed equally. Access reflected status, occupation, and affiliation, reinforcing hierarchy through spatial privilege. Yet even modest households sought some form of interior refuge. A shaded corner, a narrow courtyard, or a protected well offered minimal relief essential to endurance. Adaptation occurred at every level of society, reflecting shared understanding of environmental pressure. Survival demanded creativity within constraint. Maintenance required constant effort. Walls cracked, plants withered, and water systems deteriorated without attention, reminding inhabitants that stability was never permanent. Neglect carried consequences that accumulated quickly. Seasonal change altered the use of these spaces. During extreme heat, courtyards became central to daily life, while cooler periods shifted activity outward towards streets and markets. Flexibility preserved function across time. The gardens shaped perception of time itself. Hours passed differently within enclosed shade, slowing urgency and allowing tasks to unfold at sustainable pace. Temporal pressure eased without disappearing. Visitors unfamiliar with the city often overlooked these spaces. They focused on mosques, markets, and visible exchange, missing the quieter infrastructure that sustained endurance. What preserved the city operated largely out of sight. Hidden gardens embodied Timbuktu's broader strategy for survival. Rather than confronting environment directly, the city created controlled interior conditions that mitigated severity without denying reality. Adaptation replaced defiance. These spaces allowed intensity and rest to coexist. Trade, scholarship, and governance demanded energy, while recovery ensured continuity. Balance mattered more than speed. Memory accumulated here. Generations occupied the same enclosed spaces, repeating patterns of use that linked past and present through habit rather than record. Continuity became embodied. Loss threatened these environments constantly. Conflict, neglect, or resource scarcity could render courtyards unusable, disrupting daily rhythm and increasing vulnerability. Recovery required collective effort. During periods of instability, these spaces offered refuge without isolation. Families turned inward, preserving internal order while external conditions deteriorated. Adaptation intensified under pressure. The existence of hidden gardens complicates simplified narratives of the city. Timbuktu was not merely exposed and harsh, nor was it secretly opulent, but carefully regulated through layers of quiet intervention. Survival depended on subtlety. Endurance emerged through accumulation of small advantages. Shade, silence, water, and enclosure combined to reduce strain incrementally rather than eliminate it. Incremental relief sustained life. The hidden gardens did not remove hardship from daily existence. They prevented it from becoming overwhelming. That prevention made continuity possible. In a city shaped by heat, movement, and uncertainty, these enclosed spaces allowed life to proceed without collapse. They created moments of stillness without denying vigilance, rest without surrender, and continuity without illusion. Restraint ensured survival. Timbuktu's endurance depended as much on these unseen spaces as on trade routes, scholarship, or reputation. What sustained the city was not spectacle, but quiet regulation repeated daily across generations. The hidden gardens made persistence possible. As the sun began to sink beyond the horizon, Timbuktu did not experience relief so much as transition, because night did not erase the demands of the desert, but rearranged them into a different pattern that required its own discipline, awareness, and restraint. Daylight receded slowly, drawing long shadows across walls and courtyards, while heat lingered in the earth itself, refusing to dissipate quickly and reminding inhabitants that the city's rhythms were shaped by accumulation rather than sudden change. Nightfall marked not an end, but a recalibration of effort, movement, and attention. The city's streets transformed first. Markets that had operated under careful timing began to close in deliberate sequence, not hurriedly, but with practiced efficiency that minimized exposure and conserved energy. Stalls were dismantled, goods secured, and disputes deferred rather than resolved hastily, because darkness demanded caution over resolution. Sound changed as light faded. Voices softened, footsteps slowed, and the layered noise of commerce thinned into quieter exchanges that carried more weight because they were fewer. The city did not fall silent, but it became selective. Lanterns appeared gradually. Small sources of light illuminated doorways, courtyards, and paths that required navigation, creating islands of visibility rather than uniform brightness. Illumination was rationed, not for scarcity alone, but to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Movement at night followed established patterns. People traveled with purpose rather than curiosity, avoiding unnecessary wandering that increased risk in a city where darkness could conceal both opportunity and danger. Familiar routes replaced exploration. The desert pressed closer after sunset. Cooler air moved inward, carrying fine sand that settled quietly on surfaces already coated by the day, reinforcing the sense that the boundary between city and environment remained permeable. Night did not protect against intrusion. Temperature dropped unevenly. Stone, earth, and air released heat at different rates, producing pockets of warmth and cold that shaped where people gathered and where they withdrew. Comfort remained relative and temporary. Within households, night restructured activity. Meals were taken deliberately, often in enclosed courtyards where residual warmth lingered, and conversation unfolded slowly as fatigue from the day demanded restraint. Energy was conserved for what mattered. Children were brought closer. Families reduced exposure by gathering inward, reinforcing boundaries that protected against both environmental and social uncertainty. Night intensified cohesion. Scholars adjusted their work. Some continued study under controlled light, reading or reciting quietly to preserve concentration without exhausting sight or attention. Others deferred intellectual labor until morning, recognizing limits imposed by fatigue and darkness. Manuscripts were handled with increased care. Low light magnified the risk of error, damage, or misinterpretation, encouraging slower engagement rather than sustained effort. Night demanded humility from learning. Religious practice shifted subtly. Prayer marked time and provided structure, but also reinforced awareness of vulnerability in a world partially obscured. Faith offered orientation rather than certainty. The streets retained presence. Guards, messengers, and those with necessity continued to move, maintaining minimal circulation required for stability. Authority did not sleep, but it diminished its visibility. Night altered perception of distance. Paths that felt manageable under daylight expanded psychologically, discouraging unnecessary travel and reinforcing local focus. The city contracted inward. Risk management became paramount. The likelihood of theft, conflict, or miscalculation increased after sunset, shaping behavior through caution rather than fear. Experience guided decision. Disputes were postponed. Night was understood as an unsuitable time for resolution, because misunderstanding flourished when visibility and endurance declined. Delay preserved stability. The desert asserted its presence more clearly. Stars emerged unobstructed, revealing scale that dwarfed the city and reinforced awareness of isolation beyond its walls. The sky reminded inhabitants of their position within a larger, indifferent system. For travelers, night intensified uncertainty. Those arriving late weighed entry against exposure, calculating whether to seek shelter outside the city or attempt navigation through partially lit streets. Judgment carried consequence. Caravans rarely moved at night near the city. Animals required rest, and coordination under low visibility increased risk. Stillness was often safer than motion. Sound carried differently. Quiet amplified footsteps and voices, making secrecy difficult and caution necessary. The city listened to itself. Smells changed. Cooking fires, cooling earth, and lingering dust combined into an atmosphere distinct from daylight, reinforcing sensory awareness. Night sharpened perception. The absence of constant activity revealed underlying structure. Without the distraction of markets and movement, patterns of authority, access, and obligation became more apparent. Order revealed itself through restraint. Social hierarchy remained visible. Some spaces retained light and activity longer, reflecting status and responsibility, while others receded quickly into darkness. Privilege shaped visibility. Night encouraged introspection. Fatigue reduced impulse, and repetition replaced novelty, allowing reflection to emerge naturally rather than through deliberate effort. Thought slowed. Stories were told quietly. Narratives passed within families and small groups, reinforcing memory and expectation without spectacle. Oral transmission thrived in stillness. Silence acquired weight. It was not empty, but filled with awareness of limits, vulnerability, and continuity. The city rested without forgetting. Night exposed fragility. Firelight flickered, shadows distorted familiar forms, and confidence depended on familiarity rather than certainty. Survival required acceptance of ambiguity. Authority adapted. Rules were enforced selectively, prioritizing prevention over punishment, because excess intervention risked escalation under low visibility. Restraint governed power. The pace of life slowed. Tasks were simplified, decisions deferred, and attention narrowed to essentials. Complexity yielded to endurance. Memory surfaced. In quieter hours, awareness of past hardship, loss, and survival intensified, reinforcing humility and caution. Night preserved perspective. Rest was earned. Sleep came unevenly, interrupted by heat, noise, or responsibility, but it remained necessary for continuation. Exhaustion threatened judgment. Those who slept lightly did so with purpose. Awareness never fully receded because the environment discouraged total surrender. Vigilance persisted. Night revealed the city's true character. Without the illusion of daytime activity, Timbuktu appeared as a system of adaptation rather than spectacle. Endurance replaced display. Visitors often misunderstood this phase. They interpreted quiet as emptiness, mistaking reduced activity for absence of life. In reality, the city conserved itself. Night sustained continuity. By limiting exposure, reducing conflict, and enforcing rhythm, it preserved the capacity to endure another day. Rest supported survival. The desert remained present. Cool air carried reminders that the city existed only through negotiation with its surroundings. Boundaries blurred. As darkness deepened, Timbuktu did not retreat. It recalibrated. Survival depended on knowing when to stop. Nightfall therefore represented discipline rather than vulnerability. It enforced limits that daylight tempted inhabitants to exceed. Restraint protected continuity. The city endured because it accepted these limits. Day and night functioned together, each correcting the excesses of the other. Balance sustained existence. When dawn eventually approached, it would not signal renewal without cost. Another cycle of endurance would begin, shaped by the memory of night's restraint. Survival remained conditional. Life in Timbuktu was shaped not by extraordinary events, but by the accumulation of ordinary pressures that repeated each day with little variation, creating a condition in which endurance mattered more than momentary strength and discipline outweighed ambition. The city's reputation for wealth, learning, and connectivity obscured the reality that survival here remained difficult even during periods of relative stability, because the desert imposed limits that no amount of knowledge or trade could fully remove. Daily life unfolded under conditions that demanded constant adjustment rather than confidence, and resilience emerged through habit rather than heroism. Heat defined the rhythm of existence. From early morning onward, rising temperatures shaped movement, labor, and concentration, forcing inhabitants to pace themselves carefully in order to avoid exhaustion that could compromise judgment and health. The body became an instrument that required management rather than exertion. Water scarcity intensified this pressure. Access to wells was regulated, monitored, and sometimes contested, because even minor miscalculations could escalate into serious threat during periods of drought or increased population. Daily planning revolved around conservation rather than abundance. Food availability fluctuated. Despite trade networks that brought grain and preserved goods into the city, supply remained vulnerable to disruption caused by weather, conflict, or shifting routes. Meals were therefore modest, structured, and rarely excessive. Illness was common. Heat-related exhaustion, dehydration, infection, and chronic conditions affected all levels of society, reminding inhabitants that knowledge and status offered limited protection against physical vulnerability. Recovery required rest that could not always be afforded. Medical knowledge existed, but it operated within constraint. Treatments relied on available materials, experience, and interpretation, acknowledging that cure was not guaranteed. Care focused on management rather than elimination of suffering. Work filled most waking hours. Whether through trade, scholarship, craftsmanship, or domestic labor, contribution was expected because dependency threatened collective stability. Idleness carried social consequence. Domestic responsibilities weighed heavily. Maintenance of homes, courtyards, and water systems demanded continuous effort, and neglect quickly produced conditions that endangered health and safety. Stability required repetition. Children participated early. From observation to assistance, they learned responsibility through exposure rather than instruction, understanding that survival depended on contribution rather than entitlement. Expectation replaced indulgence. Social hierarchy structured burden. Some roles involved physical labor, others mental endurance, but no position existed without obligation. Privilege altered burden without removing it. Enslaved individuals carried disproportionate weight. Their labor supported households and commerce, yet their vulnerability remained extreme, subject to conditions beyond their control. The city's functioning depended on inequality. Merchants faced constant calculation. Risk assessment, reputation management, and negotiation demanded attention that rarely relaxed, because error could result in loss that extended beyond material wealth. Mental strain accumulated quietly. Scholars endured different pressure. Study required sustained focus under physically taxing conditions, balancing intellectual discipline with bodily limitation. Fatigue shaped interpretation. Women carried extensive responsibility. Management of households, education of children, preservation of food and water, and maintenance of social bonds demanded endurance that often went unrecognized. Stability relied on invisible labor. Aging intensified vulnerability. As physical capacity declined, dependence increased, reinforcing the importance of kinship and reputation accumulated earlier in life. Neglect became dangerous. Conflict emerged from pressure. Scarcity, fatigue, and inequality produced tension that required mediation to prevent escalation. Order depended on restraint. Legal structures attempted to manage burden. Dispute resolution, inheritance law, and contractual obligation provided frameworks that limited chaos without eliminating hardship. Justice aimed at balance rather than relief. Religion offered meaning rather than escape. Faith provided orientation within suffering, helping individuals endure conditions they could not change. Hope existed without promise. Routine became survival strategy. Predictability reduced cognitive load, allowing energy to be preserved for essential tasks. Habit stabilized life. Rest remained insufficient. Sleep was interrupted by heat, noise, responsibility, or anxiety, leaving many in a state of persistent fatigue. Endurance required acceptance. Joy existed, but it was restrained. Celebration occurred within limits imposed by environment and obligation, reinforcing appreciation rather than excess. Pleasure remained temporary. Loss was common. Death from illness, accident, or exhaustion shaped collective memory, reminding inhabitants of fragility. Grief integrated into routine. Recovery demanded community. Individuals relied on kinship, reputation, and mutual obligation to survive periods of weakness. Isolation increased risk. Time passed unevenly. Long days blended together, punctuated by seasonal shifts that altered burden without removing it. Continuity mattered more than progress. Adaptation defined success. Those who survived longest learned when to push and when to conserve, recognizing limits without surrendering responsibility. Wisdom emerged through repetition. Visitors misunderstood this rhythm. They saw hardship and assumed stagnation, overlooking the discipline required to maintain balance. Endurance remained invisible. Daily life shaped worldview. Acceptance of limitation encouraged humility and discouraged excess, reinforcing values that prioritized survival over ambition. Expectation replaced entitlement. Nothing in Timbuktu operated without cost. Every benefit required effort, attention, and sacrifice. Continuity demanded payment. The burdens of daily life did not disappear during periods of prosperity. They merely changed form. Pressure remained constant. What sustained the city was not ease, but persistence. Individuals carried weight collectively, distributing strain across households and generations. Survival became shared labor. Timbuktu endured because its people accepted burden as a condition rather than an injustice. They adapted without illusion, recognizing that stability required discipline rather than comfort. That acceptance preserved continuity. Life in Timbuktu was shaped not by extraordinary events, but by the accumulation of ordinary pressures that repeated each day with little variation, creating a condition in which endurance mattered more than momentary strength and discipline outweighed ambition. The city's reputation for wealth, learning, and connectivity obscured the reality that survival here remained difficult even during periods of relative stability, because the desert imposed limits that no amount of knowledge or trade could fully remove. Daily life unfolded under conditions that demanded constant adjustment rather than confidence, and resilience emerged through habit rather than heroism. Heat defined the rhythm of existence. From early morning onward, rising temperatures shaped movement, labor, and concentration, forcing inhabitants to pace themselves carefully in order to avoid exhaustion that could compromise judgment and health. The body became an instrument that required management rather than exertion. Water scarcity intensified this pressure. Access to wells was regulated, monitored, and sometimes contested, because even minor miscalculations could escalate into serious threat during periods of drought or increased population. Daily planning revolved around conservation rather than abundance. Food availability fluctuated. Despite trade networks that brought grain and preserved goods into the city, supply remained vulnerable to disruption caused by weather, conflict, or shifting routes. Meals were therefore modest, structured, and rarely excessive. Illness was common. Heat-related exhaustion, dehydration, infection, and chronic conditions affected all levels of society, reminding inhabitants that knowledge and status offered limited protection against physical vulnerability. Recovery required rest that could not always be afforded. Medical knowledge existed, but it operated within constraint. Treatments relied on available materials, experience, and interpretation, acknowledging that cure was not guaranteed. Care focused on management rather than elimination of suffering. Work filled most waking hours. Whether through trade, scholarship, craftsmanship, or domestic labor, contribution was expected because dependency threatened collective stability. Idleness carried social consequence. Domestic responsibilities weighed heavily. Maintenance of homes, courtyards, and water systems demanded continuous effort, and neglect quickly produced conditions that endangered health and safety. Stability required repetition. Children participated early. From observation to assistance, they learned responsibility through exposure rather than instruction, understanding that survival depended on contribution rather than entitlement. Expectation replaced indulgence. Social hierarchy structured burden. Some roles involved physical labor, others mental endurance, but no position existed without obligation. Privilege altered burden without removing it. Enslaved individuals carried disproportionate weight. Their labor supported households and commerce, yet their vulnerability remained extreme, subject to conditions beyond their control. The city's functioning depended on inequality. Merchants faced constant calculation. Risk assessment, reputation management, and negotiation demanded attention that rarely relaxed, because error could result in loss that extended beyond material wealth. Mental strain accumulated quietly. Scholars endured different pressure. Study required sustained focus under physically taxing conditions, balancing intellectual discipline with bodily limitation. Fatigue shaped interpretation. Women carried extensive responsibility. Management of households, education of children, preservation of food and water, and maintenance of social bonds demanded endurance that often went unrecognized. Stability relied on invisible labor. Aging intensified vulnerability. As physical capacity declined, dependence increased, reinforcing the importance of kinship and reputation accumulated earlier in life. Neglect became dangerous. Conflict emerged from pressure. Scarcity, fatigue, and inequality produced tension that required mediation to prevent escalation. Order depended on restraint. Legal structures attempted to manage burden. Dispute resolution, inheritance law, and contractual obligation provided frameworks that limited chaos without eliminating hardship. Justice aimed at balance rather than relief. Religion offered meaning rather than escape. Faith provided orientation within suffering, helping individuals endure conditions they could not change. Hope existed without promise. Routine became survival strategy. Predictability reduced cognitive load, allowing energy to be preserved for essential tasks. Habit stabilized life. Rest remained insufficient. Sleep was interrupted by heat, noise, responsibility, or anxiety, leaving many in a state of persistent fatigue. Endurance required acceptance. Joy existed, but it was restrained. Celebration occurred within limits imposed by environment and obligation, reinforcing appreciation rather than excess. Pleasure remained temporary. Loss was common. Death from illness, accident, or exhaustion shaped collective memory, reminding inhabitants of fragility. Grief integrated into routine. Recovery demanded community. Individuals relied on kinship, reputation, and mutual obligation to survive periods of weakness. Isolation increased risk. Time passed unevenly. Long days blended together, punctuated by seasonal shifts that altered burden without removing it. Continuity mattered more than progress. Adaptation defined success. Those who survived longest learned when to push and when to conserve, recognizing limits without surrendering responsibility. Wisdom emerged through repetition. Visitors misunderstood this rhythm. They saw hardship and assumed stagnation, overlooking the discipline required to maintain balance. Endurance remained invisible. Daily life shaped worldview. Acceptance of limitation encouraged humility and discouraged excess, reinforcing values that prioritized survival over ambition. Expectation replaced entitlement. Nothing in Timbuktu operated without cost. Every benefit required effort, attention, and sacrifice. Continuity demanded payment. The burdens of daily life did not disappear during periods of prosperity. They merely changed form. Pressure remained constant. What sustained the city was not ease, but persistence. Individuals carried weight collectively, distributing strain across households and generations. Survival became shared labor. Timbuktu endured because its people accepted burden as a condition rather than an injustice. They adapted without illusion, recognizing that stability required discipline rather than comfort. That acceptance preserved continuity. Death in Timbuktu was never treated as a distant abstraction or an unexpected rupture, but existed as a constant reference point embedded quietly within daily decision-making, shaping behavior, belief, and social responsibility long before the body failed or breath ceased. Life unfolded under the awareness that endurance was provisional and that survival depended not on avoiding death entirely, which was impossible, but on managing proximity to it through discipline, restraint, and preparation. In a city where heat, illness, scarcity, and exhaustion pressed persistently against the limits of the human body, mortality became something to be accounted for rather than feared irrationally. Death was anticipated. This anticipation did not produce despair, but encouraged calculation, because individuals understood that misjudgment carried consequences not only for themselves, but for households, students, dependents, and networks bound together by obligation. Every action therefore existed within an unspoken framework that considered risk, responsibility, and continuity beyond the individual lifespan. Illness was common and often unpredictable. Infections, dehydration, heat exhaustion, and chronic conditions progressed quickly in an environment that offered limited relief, forcing people to acknowledge vulnerability without illusion. Medical knowledge aimed to manage decline rather than promise recovery, reinforcing realism over optimism. Aging intensified this awareness. As physical strength diminished, individuals adjusted their roles, transferring labor, authority, and knowledge to younger members of the household in deliberate stages rather than sudden surrender. Preparation for death began long before its arrival. Inheritance was structured carefully. Property, manuscripts, responsibilities, and social obligations were distributed according to legal frameworks designed to reduce conflict after death, because unresolved disputes threatened stability. Death required order to prevent chaos. Legal scholarship devoted significant attention to mortality. Wills, inheritance law, and obligations toward dependents formed a core concern, reflecting recognition that death disrupted systems unless anticipated. Calculation replaced denial. Burial practices reflected restraint. Graves were simple, emphasizing humility and continuity rather than individual distinction, because excess display contradicted ethical expectations. Death did not elevate status. Funeral rituals reinforced community. They reminded participants that loss affected collective stability and that survival required mutual support rather than isolation. Grief was structured to prevent disintegration. Religious belief framed death without eliminating uncertainty. Faith offered meaning, accountability, and hope, but did not promise protection from suffering or premature loss. Mortality remained unavoidable. Judgment after death mattered. Actions taken in life were believed to carry consequence beyond it, encouraging ethical calculation rather than impulsive behavior. Responsibility extended past the grave. This belief shaped conduct. Merchants weighed honesty against gain, scholars measured interpretation against accountability, and leaders considered restraint as a form of legacy. Reputation endured longer than the body. The dead were remembered selectively. Lineage, scholarship, and contribution determined memory more than wealth or spectacle. Legacy required substance. Manuscripts functioned as vessels of survival beyond death. Scholars wrote knowing their words might outlast their bodies, and that transmission represented a form of continuation. Knowledge became inheritance. Families preserved memory through practice rather than monument. Names, roles, and expectations passed quietly through repetition, reinforcing continuity without excessive commemoration. Survival depended on function, not nostalgia. Child mortality reinforced realism. Loss occurred early and often, forcing families to integrate grief without allowing it to paralyze responsibility. Endurance demanded acceptance. Death altered households abruptly. Labor redistributed, authority reassigned, and vulnerability increased until balance reestablished itself through adaptation. Recovery required structure. Social networks absorbed loss. Kinship, scholarship, and trade relationships redistributed burden, preventing collapse when individuals disappeared. Collective survival depended on redundancy. The calculation extended to risk-taking. Travel, trade, and scholarship involved danger, but avoidance of all risk threatened stagnation and eventual decline. Balance determined survival. Caravan leaders understood mortality. They weighed profit against loss of life, calculating acceptable risk within an environment that punished misjudgment severely. Leadership demanded foresight. Scholars considered fatigue. Exhaustion impaired judgment and invited illness, encouraging moderation in study and teaching. Discipline protected longevity. Even joy was calculated. Celebration occurred within limits that preserved health and stability, recognizing that excess increased vulnerability. Pleasure remained controlled. The city itself embodied this logic. Architecture, trade, and law reflected awareness that collapse occurred not through single events, but through accumulated neglect. Maintenance prevented death at scale. Death shaped worldview. Acceptance of mortality discouraged illusions of permanence and reinforced values of restraint, humility, and preparation. Survival was temporary by design. The absence of denial strengthened resilience. By acknowledging fragility, individuals reduced shock when loss occurred, allowing continuity to resume more quickly. Expectation replaced surprise. Foreign observers often misinterpreted this attitude. They mistook restraint for pessimism, overlooking its function as a survival strategy. Realism preserved endurance. The city mourned without collapsing. Loss was integrated rather than dramatized, because excessive grief threatened those who remained. Stability demanded moderation. Even spiritual leaders emphasized preparation. Teachings reinforced accountability, legacy, and restraint rather than promise of protection. Faith supported endurance. Death was discussed openly. Avoidance offered no advantage in a world where mortality remained visible and frequent. Clarity reduced fear. Children learned this early. Exposure to loss shaped expectation, encouraging responsibility and caution rather than innocence. Maturity arrived quickly. The city calculated death to preserve life. Every system accounted for absence, replacement, and continuation. Continuity mattered more than individuals. Timbuktu endured because it did not pretend otherwise. It accepted mortality as a governing condition rather than an anomaly. That acceptance prevented collapse. Death did not end participation. Through memory, obligation, and transmitted knowledge, the dead continued to shape the living. Survival extended beyond breath. In this way, mortality reinforced discipline rather than despair. Calculation replaced fear, and preparation replaced illusion. Endurance remained possible. In Timbuktu, the boundary between the living and the dead was never understood as a clean separation, because memory, obligation, and inherited responsibility allowed those who had passed to remain embedded within daily life, shaping decisions, conduct, and restraint long after their physical presence had disappeared. Death did not remove influence, nor did burial erase participation, but transformed authority into something quieter and more persistent, operating through precedent, reputation, and expectation rather than command. The dead remained present not as figures of fear or worship, but as accumulated consequence that continued to weigh on the living. This presence was felt most strongly through lineage. Family identity extended backward as well as forward, binding individuals to the actions, judgments, and failures of those who came before them, and reinforcing the understanding that survival depended not only on personal conduct, but on the continuity of reputation across generations. Inheritance therefore carried moral weight in addition to material responsibility. Graves reflected this worldview. They were deliberately simple, avoiding excess that might elevate the individual above the collective or suggest permanence where none was claimed, yet their restraint did not imply insignificance, because remembrance was enacted through behavior rather than monument. Memory lived in conduct, not stone. Homes and courtyards retained the presence of former occupants. Spaces were used with awareness of who had lived, taught, labored, or died within them, and this awareness influenced how authority, responsibility, and privilege were exercised. Absence shaped behavior as powerfully as presence. Scholars encountered the dead constantly. Every manuscript carried the trace of previous hands, voices, and judgments, embedding intellectual life within chains of transmission that preserved accountability across time. Interpretation occurred within inherited frameworks rather than isolated insight. Margins filled with commentary extended conversation beyond lifespan. Agreement, correction, and disagreement accumulated slowly, allowing voices long gone to continue shaping understanding without claiming final authority. Knowledge survived through dialogue rather than fixation. Legal reasoning relied heavily on precedent. Judgments referenced earlier interpretations, ensuring that decisions were constrained by continuity rather than impulse, and that the reasoning of the dead continued to limit the actions of the living. Law functioned as memory structured for survival. This continuity imposed discipline. Knowing that actions would be remembered, cited, and measured against prior conduct discouraged excess and reinforced caution, because reputation extended beyond individual life and shaped the position of descendants. Legacy became a form of restraint. Fear of dishonor mattered more than fear of punishment. To damage one's lineage threatened not only present standing, but future security, making ethical calculation a multi-generational concern rather than a personal choice. Responsibility extended both backward and forward. Religious belief reinforced this structure without transforming it into superstition. The afterlife emphasized accountability and continuity rather than escape, reinforcing the idea that actions carried consequence beyond immediate reward or loss. Faith supported responsibility rather than replacing it. Prayer for the dead functioned as reminder. It acknowledged continuity rather than separation, reinforcing obligation without invoking fear. Ritual sustained memory. Grief followed structure. Excessive mourning threatened stability, while neglect signaled disregard for obligation, requiring balance that preserved cohesion without denying loss. Emotion remained integrated into survival. Children learned this framework early. They were taught lineage, responsibility, and expectation through story, behavior, and correction, absorbing the understanding that identity extended beyond the self. Belonging required continuity. The dead influenced decision-making indirectly. Choices were weighed against precedent and expectation, asking not only what was possible, but what would endure without damaging inherited balance. Memory constrained ambition. Innovation therefore proceeded cautiously. Change required justification rooted in continuity, because deviation without context threatened stability. Evolution unfolded within inherited limits. During periods of instability, the presence of the dead intensified. When authority weakened or conditions deteriorated, memory provided structure where enforcement faltered, reinforcing restraint when power became unreliable. The past stabilized the present. Loss sharpened awareness. As death increased through illness, conflict, or exhaustion, the absence of individuals reinforced the understanding that survival depended on honoring systems that outlasted any single life. Continuity required vigilance. The city itself functioned as archive. Routines, spaces, and expectations preserved layers of memory that guided behavior without constant articulation. History lived through habit. Visitors sensed this weight without always understanding it. They encountered restraint, hesitation, and adherence to form that appeared excessive, but served to preserve balance shaped by accumulated experience. Memory guided caution. The dead also limited power. Leaders acted within precedent, aware that authority extended only as far as memory permitted, and that excess invited comparison rather than admiration. Governance remained constrained. Attempts to erase or rewrite memory threatened stability. Forgetting weakened accountability, while continuity preserved coherence across change. Survival depended on remembrance. The dead were not revered as objects of devotion. They were acknowledged as participants whose consequences endured. Recognition replaced worship. Through this acknowledgement, responsibility persisted. The living understood themselves as temporary stewards rather than owners of the city's systems, bound to preserve rather than redefine them recklessly. Humility ensured endurance. Timbuktu remained watched not by spirits intervening directly, but by memory embedded so deeply into conduct that surveillance became internal. The dead shaped behavior through consequence rather than command. That influence sustained the living. The change that reached Timbuktu did not arrive as a single day of defeat, nor as a clear moment in which everyone agreed that an older world had ended, but unfolded through a long sequence of pressures that accumulated quietly until familiar explanations began to sound thin against what people could see and feel in their own lives. Belief, in any society, endures not only because it is taught, but because it continues to organize fear, loss, risk, and responsibility into a pattern that makes survival feel intelligible rather than random. When that pattern stops matching lived experience, the failure is rarely dramatic at first, because people continue to repeat the same forms while noticing, often privately and reluctantly, that the forms no longer hold the weight they once carried. In Timbuktu, older frameworks were never merely private convictions, because faith, law, scholarship, and social order were braided tightly together, shaping how trade was regulated, how disputes were mediated, how authority was recognized, and how suffering was interpreted without requiring constant coercion. For a long time, that braid held, partly because the city's success depended on discipline and continuity, and partly because its intellectual culture trained people to live within limits, to respect precedent, and to accept that certainty was rare even when faith remained strong. Yet the very conditions that had produced this stability also created vulnerability, because a city built on movement and exchange could not control the forces that altered movement, nor could it prevent the world beyond the desert from changing faster than inherited frameworks could absorb. Trade did not collapse overnight, but its reliability weakened in ways that were felt first as inconvenience, then as anxiety, and eventually as structural strain that altered how households planned, how merchants calculated risk, and how scholars interpreted the meaning of endurance. Routes shifted gradually, sometimes because of political conflict along key passages, sometimes because of changing balances of power that affected taxation and protection, and sometimes because wider patterns of commerce began to privilege different corridors of exchange. When the flow of goods becomes less predictable, the moral confidence of a society often weakens as well, because scarcity intensifies tension and forces people to compromise in ways that are difficult to reconcile with the ideals that once felt natural. The pressure did not only come from economics, because political authority in the region was never static, and Timbuktu's position depended on the ability of larger powers to provide enough stability that trade and learning could continue without constant disruption. When rulers changed, the terms of governance could change with them, and when external threats intensified, the city's systems were forced to adapt, sometimes by narrowing access, sometimes by increasing enforcement, and sometimes by accepting arrangements that would have seemed unacceptable in calmer times. The result was not immediate collapse, but a subtle hardening of life, in which survival demanded more vigilance for the same returns, and where the emotional cost of maintaining continuity began to rise. Older religious and scholarly frameworks did not disappear, because they were deeply embedded in education, ritual, and law, and because they continued to provide language for accountability, restraint, and responsibility even when circumstances grew harsher. However, a framework can remain present while losing its ability to persuade, and that loss often reveals itself through repetition that feels increasingly mechanical, through debates that circle familiar ground without resolving new contradictions, and through a quiet increase in cynicism among those who are forced to make hard compromises in order to keep households functioning. When belief is confronted repeatedly by outcomes that appear indifferent to moral effort, people do not always abandon belief, but they begin to treat it as something that must be carried rather than something that carries them. Scholars, in particular, would have felt this tension with unusual clarity, because they were trained to interpret the world, to reconcile law with lived reality, and to sustain intellectual continuity even when material conditions deteriorated. The scholarly culture of Timbuktu valued discipline over spectacle, and it encouraged slow reasoning rather than impulsive certainty, which meant that doubt would not have appeared as rebellion, but as a measured awareness that interpretation was becoming harder, not because texts had changed, but because life was presenting questions that older assumptions did not anticipate. When legal precedents and moral expectations stop fitting the forms of conflict that scarcity produces, the authority of precedent does not vanish, but it begins to strain, and strain is often the first visible sign of weakening coherence. A city that had once been a convergence point for goods and ideas could still function when trade weakened, but it would do so under increasing tension, because the social contract that binds merchants, scholars, and households together depends on the expectation that effort will usually be rewarded with continuity. If caravans arrive less frequently, if prices fluctuate more sharply, if protection becomes less reliable, and if political demands become heavier, then even the most disciplined society begins to experience a shift in mood, in which patience remains a virtue but becomes harder to sustain without bitterness. That bitterness does not always speak loudly, yet it alters judgment, making people more cautious, more defensive, and less willing to invest in long-term obligations that depend on stability. In such circumstances, the failure of older gods, older frameworks, or older certainties is rarely a matter of theology alone, because the deeper issue is not whether people stop believing, but whether belief continues to function as an organizing principle that reduces chaos. When a worldview explains suffering as meaningful, it can stabilize communities even under hardship, but when suffering becomes repetitive, intensified, and seemingly disconnected from effort or virtue, then the explanatory power of the worldview weakens, and the old language begins to sound like a description of a different world. People may continue to pray, to study, and to obey, while privately noticing that the link between meaning and outcome feels less stable than it once did. The pressure of external influence intensified this process, because contact with other centers of power introduced new comparisons, new claims of legitimacy, and new expectations that did not always align with local balance. When a community is exposed to multiple systems that each claim authority, the question is not simply which system is true, but which system works, which system protects, and which system can be lived without constant internal contradiction. Comparison, even when conducted quietly, is corrosive to certainty, because it introduces the idea that what was once assumed to be necessary might have been contingent all along. Timbuktu's intellectual tradition could accommodate difference to a degree, because scholarship thrives on interpretation, debate, and adaptation within recognized boundaries, yet the presence of competing frameworks becomes destabilizing when political power shifts in ways that make some interpretations safer than others. When authority begins to demand conformity, scholarship becomes more cautious, not necessarily because scholars abandon rigor, but because survival forces them to calculate risk, and calculation always changes the emotional texture of belief. A worldview that once felt expansive can begin to feel defensive, and defensiveness is often a sign that coherence is weakening. At the same time, the city's relationship with the desert created its own kind of spiritual realism, because daily life in such an environment teaches people that nature does not negotiate, that scarcity returns, and that safety is never absolute. This realism can support faith by preventing naive expectations, yet it also means that when hardship intensifies, people are less likely to be shocked and more likely to become exhausted, and exhaustion is a powerful solvent of meaning. A society can endure many losses if it believes those losses fit into a coherent order, but it begins to change when losses feel merely repetitive, when they no longer teach, and when they appear to demand sacrifice without offering orientation. The weakening of older frameworks would therefore have been felt not as a public declaration that the old gods had failed, but as a shift in the way people spoke, the way they planned, and the way they measured the future. Merchants might become more conservative, prioritizing survival over expansion. Scholars might focus more intensely on preservation than debate, and households might invest more in immediate security than in long-term projects that depend on stable networks. When a society begins to shorten its horizon, the change is psychological before it becomes visible in architecture or law. Preservation becomes a defensive act under such conditions, not because people suddenly become nostalgic, but because they sense instability and respond by holding more tightly to what can still be controlled. Texts are copied with greater urgency, manuscripts are hidden more carefully, and instruction becomes more focused on continuity rather than exploration, because the future feels less like an extension of the present and more like a threat to it. In this way, the old world can continue to exist in form while losing its confidence in its own permanence. Political disruption accelerates this psychological shift, because when governance becomes unpredictable, people become more cautious in public life and more reliant on private networks of trust, kinship, and obligation. A city sustained by exchange depends on a baseline of public reliability, and when reliability weakens, private arrangements replace open confidence, creating a social texture in which survival depends on narrower circles. This narrowing does not always look like collapse, yet it changes the emotional atmosphere of a city, making it quieter, more careful, and less willing to take the risks that once sustained prosperity. In such a context, the failure of old gods is best understood as the gradual failure of old assurances, because the older worldview may remain intellectually present while losing its ability to guarantee that endurance will lead to stability. A belief can survive indefinitely in theory, yet its social power depends on whether it still feels like a bridge between suffering and meaning, and whether it can still persuade people that sacrifice will be translated into continuity. When that translation becomes unreliable, the old framework continues, but it becomes heavier to carry, and heaviness is often the first sign that a worldview is shifting from lived certainty into inherited duty. The city could still pray, still teach, still trade, and still maintain its routines, while the internal experience of those routines changed, becoming more defensive, more cautious, and less confident that repetition would be rewarded with the same stability as before. This is how worldviews often end, not with an argument that defeats them, but with a slow divergence between the world they describe and the world people inhabit, until the words remain familiar, but the fit becomes uncomfortable. When that discomfort becomes common, the old gods have not been disproven, yet their authority has weakened, because authority depends on coherence rather than memory alone. What replaces the older worldview is rarely a clean alternative, because new frameworks also struggle against scarcity, politics, and mortality, and they rarely offer certainty, yet they may offer different tools for adaptation, different moral emphases, and different ways to interpret change without feeling that change itself is betrayal. Transformation, in this sense, is not a victory of one system over another, but a gradual recalibration of how people manage uncertainty, how they justify restraint, and how they organize responsibility when older assurances no longer feel sufficient. Timbuktu's endurance under these conditions would therefore have depended less on any single belief, and more on the capacity of its people to preserve continuity, while acknowledging that the world around them had shifted beyond the reach of inherited certainty. The collapse that followed did not resemble conquest, destruction, or a single moment of irreversible loss, because what began to fail in Timbuktu was not primarily its buildings, its people, or even its institutions, but the underlying worldview that had once made endurance feel purposeful rather than merely necessary. This collapse unfolded slowly enough that those living through it rarely recognized it as collapse at all, because life continued, routines persisted, and familiar forms remained visible long after their internal coherence had begun to weaken. What disappeared was not the city itself, but the confidence that its inherited systems could still translate effort into stability in a way that felt reliable and justifiable. For centuries, Timbuktu had functioned through a delicate alignment between belief, environment, trade, and social order, an alignment that did not promise comfort, but did offer orientation, allowing people to endure hardship with the expectation that discipline and restraint would preserve continuity. When this alignment began to loosen, the first signs were not riots or rebellion, but subtle changes in behavior, tone, and planning, as individuals adjusted their expectations downward without fully articulating why. A society rarely collapses by abandoning its rules. It collapses by continuing to follow them while quietly losing faith in their outcomes. Trade still existed, but its rhythm felt less dependable. Caravans arrived irregularly, routes shifted more often, and profits fluctuated in ways that made long-term calculation increasingly difficult, forcing merchants to prioritize immediate survival over expansion or investment. This change did not destroy commerce, but it altered its emotional foundation, replacing confidence with caution and ambition with preservation. Scholarship persisted, yet its orientation shifted. Where earlier generations had balanced preservation with interpretation, later scholars devoted increasing energy to safeguarding existing knowledge rather than expanding it, sensing that continuity itself was under threat. Learning became defensive, focused on maintaining inheritance rather than engaging openly with uncertainty. Legal systems continued to operate, but their authority felt heavier. Judgments still referenced precedent, yet the gap between law and lived reality widened as circumstances changed faster than interpretation could adapt. Justice became something to endure rather than trust. Religious practice remained visible. Prayer, recitation, and ritual continued to structure time and behavior, but for many, faith shifted from a source of reassurance into a discipline of obligation, carried forward more through habit than conviction. Belief did not vanish, but its emotional texture changed. Households adjusted quietly. Families invested more in immediate security, hoarding resources when possible, narrowing social networks, and relying increasingly on kinship rather than public institutions to absorb loss. Trust retreated inward. The city's physical fabric reflected this change subtly. Buildings were maintained just enough to remain functional, while expansion slowed and ambitious construction ceased, signaling a collective decision to conserve rather than grow. Maintenance replaced aspiration. Hierarchy tightened. Access to opportunity narrowed, and mobility slowed as risk increased, reinforcing inequality without requiring new laws or declarations. Position became harder to change. For younger generations, the inherited worldview felt increasingly burdensome. They were taught discipline, restraint, and responsibility, yet encountered a world in which those virtues no longer guaranteed stability, producing tension between expectation and experience. Obedience demanded sacrifice without assurance. Elders sensed loss without always naming it. Memory contrasted the present with earlier coherence, intensifying efforts to preserve tradition even as its capacity to organize life weakened. Preservation became urgency. This urgency accelerated decline. Systems preserved without adaptation grow brittle, and brittleness increases the damage caused by pressure. Rigidity invited fracture. The worldview did not collapse uniformly. Some individuals adapted, blending older frameworks with pragmatic adjustment, while others clung tightly to inherited forms, deepening division within the same cultural space. Fragmentation replaced consensus. External powers reshaped the region further. New political and economic centers redirected influence away from trans-Saharan networks, reducing Timbuktu's strategic relevance without erasing it entirely. Marginalization replaced centrality. Global shifts compounded local strain. Maritime trade routes bypassed inland hubs, undermining the economic logic that had sustained the city's prominence for centuries. The world moved around Timbuktu rather than through it. This change was not immediately catastrophic. Life continued, scholarship survived, and trade persisted at reduced scale, allowing the illusion of continuity to endure. But illusion could not replace function. The city's identity shifted from active center to remembered symbol. Its reputation outlived its influence, creating a gap between how Timbuktu was spoken about elsewhere and how it was experienced by those who remained. Myth replaced immediacy. This gap affected morale. Living within a legend while experiencing decline intensified dissonance, making endurance feel heavier because it no longer aligned with expectation. Memory became weight. Preservation intensified. Manuscripts were hidden, traditions guarded, and stories repeated with greater insistence, reflecting awareness that loss was accelerating. Continuity demanded defense. Yet defense alone could not restore coherence. The worldview had been shaped for a world that no longer existed, and no amount of repetition could fully bridge that gap. Adaptation remained partial. Collapse, in this sense, was not defeat. It was transformation experienced as loss, because what disappeared was not life itself, but the confidence that life unfolded within a stable moral and economic order. Meaning eroded faster than survival. Those who remained adapted pragmatically. They continued to live, trade, teach, and pray, but with reduced expectation that effort would restore former balance. Endurance replaced aspiration. The city did not empty. It thinned. Population declined gradually, leaving behind spaces that felt quieter without appearing ruined. Silence increased. Markets contracted, debates softened, and ambition retreated into maintenance. Energy conserved itself. The worldview that had once sustained Timbuktu dissolved into fragments. Elements persisted independently, but the unified structure that had once connected belief, trade, law, and environment no longer held. Coherence was lost. This loss was not mourned publicly. There was no ceremony for the end of a worldview. Life simply became heavier. Survival continued without reassurance. People adapted to diminished horizons, accepting that the future would not mirror the past. Expectation adjusted downward. What remained was not failure in absolute terms. It was survival without the promise of restoration. Continuity persisted at reduced scale. The slow collapse of the worldview did not erase Timbuktu. It changed what the city meant to itself. Identity shifted inward. The city endured, but differently. It no longer stood as a center of certainty, but as a place where endurance itself became the primary value. Survival replaced coherence. This transformation marked the true end of an era. Not because life stopped, but because meaning no longer aligned seamlessly with effort. The world had moved on. To ask whether you would have survived in the world that shaped Timbuktu is not to ask a question about courage, intelligence, or moral strength in isolation, but to confront a form of existence in which survival depended on alignment with forces that rarely explained themselves and never adjusted to individual desire. This was a world in which fate was not imagined as a dramatic decree delivered at birth, but as a continuous accumulation of conditions, environmental, social, political, and moral, that narrowed or expanded possibility regardless of effort. Survival in such a setting was not achieved through exceptional moments, but through sustained discipline applied quietly across years, often without recognition or reassurance. To live here required acceptance of limits before ambition. The desert did not reward defiance, and neither did the city, because both operated on principles that punished excess more reliably than they rewarded boldness. Endurance demanded an ability to read constraint not as failure, but as instruction. You would have woken each day knowing that stability was provisional. Food, water, health, reputation, and protection existed within margins that could narrow suddenly through forces you did not control, and planning therefore required humility rather than confidence. Survival depended less on optimism than on preparedness for disappointment. Your identity would not have belonged solely to you. Family, lineage, reputation, and obligation would have shaped your choices long before personal preference entered consideration, because isolation increased vulnerability and independence carried risk. Belonging demanded compliance as well as protection. Effort alone would not have guaranteed outcome. You could labor diligently, act ethically, and plan carefully, yet still face loss through drought, illness, political disruption, or the failure of routes that sustain the city's existence. Meaning had to coexist with unpredictability. Faith, if you held it, would not have promised rescue. It would have offered orientation, rules for conduct, language for loss, and boundaries for desire, without assuring that suffering would be brief or deserved. Belief functioned as structure, not shield. You would have learned restraint early. Speech, movement, ambition, and even joy would have been moderated by awareness that excess attracted consequence, and that survival favored those who conserved energy and attention. Discipline replaced expression. Knowledge, if you pursued it, would have demanded patience. Study unfolded slowly, under conditions that tested endurance, and learning offered no guarantee of security beyond reputation earned over time. Understanding required submission to process. You would have lived among hierarchies you did not design. Some positions carried protection, others carried exposure, and movement between them occurred gradually, if at all. Acceptance determined safety more often than resistance. Death would not have been distant. Loss would have occurred around you regularly, reinforcing awareness that continuity depended on systems that absorbed absence rather than prevented it. Mortality shaped calculation. Memory would have watched you. The expectations of the dead, preserved through reputation, law, and tradition, would have constrained your actions even when enforcement was absent. Responsibility extended beyond life. You would have measured yourself against precedent. Innovation required justification, and deviation invited scrutiny, because stability relied on continuity rather than novelty. Change unfolded cautiously. Comfort would have been relative. Moments of relief existed, but they were brief, contained, and earned through restraint rather than abundance. Satisfaction was measured quietly. You would have learned to live without assurance. The future would not have appeared as progress, but as uncertainty to be navigated with care, repetition, and attention. Expectation adjusted downward. Ambition would have required negotiation. Every expansion of risk demanded calculation against responsibility to household, lineage, and community, because individual failure carried collective cost. Freedom was conditional. The city would not have asked whether you felt fulfilled. It would have asked whether you functioned. Survival mattered more than expression. If you endured long enough, you might have adapted. You would have learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to push and when to conserve, and when acceptance preserved more than resistance ever could. Wisdom emerged through repetition. Yet adaptation carried weight. Living within constraint required emotional compression, and over time, this compression altered how people related to hope, loss, and possibility. Endurance reshaped desire. Some would have survived by narrowing their world. They would have reduced expectation, limited exposure, and relied heavily on routine to preserve stability. Safety emerged through contraction. Others would have survived by aligning themselves with structure. They would have internalized hierarchy, obligation, and restraint, finding security in compliance rather than challenge. Order replaced aspiration. Many would not have survived at all. Not because they lacked strength or intelligence, but because the environment punished miscalculation relentlessly and offered little margin for recovery. Loss was not moral. This world did not reward intention. It rewarded alignment. Survival belonged to those who learned to move within limits rather than attempt to overcome them. To imagine yourself here is to confront a form of existence where dignity was quiet, resilience was ordinary, and heroism was indistinguishable from discipline. It was a world that did not promise meaning, but demanded that meaning be constructed carefully within constraint. Endurance became its own measure. If you lived long enough, you might have stopped asking whether life was fair. You would have asked whether it was manageable. That question shaped behavior. The city would not have offered reassurance. It would have offered continuity, conditional and fragile, sustained through effort that rarely felt rewarded in the moment. Hope became procedural. Survival here was not about triumph. It was about remaining functional within systems that could not be transformed quickly or completely. Persistence defined success. And so the question remains, not as fantasy, but as confrontation. Would you have endured a world where fate was not a story, but a structure that shaped every decision quietly and relentlessly? Or would the weight of discipline, uncertainty, and inherited obligation have broken you long before the desert ever did? What this world reveals, when stripped of legend and distance, is not romance or cruelty alone, but a sustained human effort to remain functional under conditions that rarely rewarded virtue and never guaranteed fairness. Timbuktu did not survive because it was protected, enlightened, or favored by history, but because its people learned to endure pressure without expecting resolution, adapting their beliefs, routines, and ambitions to limits that could not be negotiated. Endurance here was not heroic, and it was never celebrated loudly, because survival depended on discipline practiced quietly and repeated daily without promise of recognition. This was a society shaped by constraint rather than opportunity. Meaning was constructed carefully, obligation outweighed desire, and continuity mattered more than expression, because instability punished excess more reliably than it rewarded aspiration. Life unfolded not as progress, but as management. What collapsed in the end was not intelligence, faith, or effort, but alignment. The world changed faster than inherited systems could adjust, and when explanation no longer matched experience, endurance became heavier, not because people grew weaker, but because certainty grew thinner. Survival continued without reassurance. To imagine yourself here is to confront a reality where comfort was rare, security provisional, and meaning never guaranteed by effort alone. It is to recognize that resilience often looks ordinary, that discipline replaces hope, and that survival is frequently indistinguishable from adaptation. This was not a world built for fulfillment. It was a world built for endurance. After everything you have heard, the heat, the hierarchy, the discipline, the belief, the slow erosion of certainty, the question is no longer about admiration or distance. It is personal. Would you have endured a life where effort did not promise reward, where belief offered structure but not protection, and where survival depended on knowing when to yield rather than when to push? Would you have accepted a world that asked you to function rather than flourish, to adapt rather than overcome, and to carry obligation quietly without assurance that the future would improve? Or would the weight of restraint, uncertainty, and inherited expectation have broken you long before the city itself began to fade? Thank you for traveling with me. May the echoes of the past carry you into a peaceful sleep.